So the first case study I wanted to bring you to is northern Thailand. And I first went there in 2005. I was a grad student and I was really interested in studying human trafficking, which apparently every grad student interested in human rights is interested in human trafficking, which is a good thing, but there are a lot of folks in Thailand looking at this. And I was in Bangkok for a while, and I was talking to UN officials and US State Department officials and a lot of people doing good work. I was talking to a lot of sex workers. I was not telling this to my grandmother when I called home to let her know how the trip was going, but I was talking to a lot of sex workers. And the thing I kept hearing about was this idea of statelessness, which I had never heard of before. So it turns out, basically the situation is, if you can see that map, that whole area up in the north of Thailand and Burma and Laos, it's very mountainous. They call it the uplands. And so there are a lot of different tribes that are really unrelated, right? They don't necessarily have a common language or culture or anything like that, but they've been living in these mountains for hundreds and hundreds of years, and slowly but surely people have ended up in northern Thailand. You know, maybe wars kind of forced them that way, floods, fires, all kinds of push factors, right? And so some of these hill tribes have been in northern Thailand now for 100 years, 150 years. They're not newcomers. But unfortunately, the Thai government still approaches the situation as one of undocumented immigrants or illegal aliens. And there are a lot of different reasons for this, but one is that hill tribe people look different than mainstream Thais. So there is a racial prejudicial element happening here. And so what I found was that these people that came down from the uplands, not only do they not have citizenship in Thailand because they're being viewed as illegal immigrants, but they don't have citizenship anywhere else either, right? And so they're down in this area and they're being, they've got this one issue where their right to nationality is being violated, because you actually do have a human right to a nationality to a country. But that kind of serves as a root cause for all of this other bad stuff, all of these other human rights violations. So it's a very, very bad situation. So I went up to Maesai, which is a little border town right on the border of Burma. I could ride my bike to the checkpoint if I wanted to. And I was working with an organization that I guess in many ways resembled an orphanage, right? So if you want to see the human face of statelessness, this is what it looks like, right? Really, really cool, smart, fun kids. And so some of these children had been rescued from the sex trade. In fact, our youngest person who had been taken out of a brothel was 6 years old, which is just horrific. But a lot of these kids, I'm very happy to say, had been rescued sooner, and a lot of times that's because they had parents who were very, very self-aware, and the parents knew that maybe they didn't have the money to support their children, but they certainly weren't going to give them up to human traffickers that were coming around and making all sorts of promises, right? We'll get your kid a job in Bangkok, they'll send money home, they'll be a waiter or whatever. The parents were educating themselves and realizing that wasn't actually what was going to be happening to their kids. And so they'd often turn them over to the center to receive a private education and to be, have food and shelter. And a lot of these parents would come on weekends and visit, so they didn't just give up their parental responsibilities, but they were trying their best to be as responsible as they could. And so to give you a sense of what it means to be stateless, because this is kind of a legalistic concept, for these children, they don't have birth certificates to start, okay? So they don't have any documentation, right? There's no legal documentation that they exist. And so this causes a lot of problems. When you just think in your own lives how often you need, say, your social security number or your driver's license or your birth certificate, okay? Like, you need it a lot. But so these children, they can't go to public school because they're not Thai citizens. They can't probably see a doctor because medical care is subsidized. And so if you're not a citizen, going to the doctor would be very, very expensive. They can't ever, say, get a passport to go to another country. They can't even get a transport permit to go down to Bangkok, where there are a lot more jobs and a lot more money because they're not supposed to be moving. When they get older, they can't get legal employment because they're not citizens and they have no documentation. And even if they wanted to get married, even when they die, they have no death certificate. So all the way across the board, they're just legally invisible. And this causes other issues. In northern Thailand, that means that you're vulnerable to things like sex trafficking and HIV/AIDS and things like that. But it also means that you're really always in this holding pattern, right? So imagine if you couldn't go to school, and even if you couldn't get a job afterward. There's no sense of purpose, right? If you think about that list for a life worth living, a life of human dignity, it's really important for people to have some sort of purpose and goals in their lives. And that's difficult to do when you're just kind of sitting around waiting, right? And we see this in a lot of places, IDP camps, refugee camps around the world. You need a sense of purpose, and that's hard to have in this situation. You're also in a holding pattern because you're always at the mercy of, say, the police or immigration officers, border control. Because if you make somebody angry, you have no papers to say that you belong there, right? So I have heard all kinds of cases of people who have never been to, say, Burma. They don't speak Burmese. They're not Burmese, and suddenly they are deported to Burma, and ta-da, you're here now, because you can't prove you belong anywhere else, right? And so although there are some stateless people who want to be refugees, who want to leave, most stateless people are actually just trying to, protect their right to place. They just want to stay in their home and live their lives, right to a decent life. They're not looking to go anywhere or do anything out of the ordinary. They really just want the ordinary, right? So I came back from Thailand in 2005, and I was all revved up about how I was going to learn everything I could about statelessness. That took about half a day, because there wasn't anything to find. What I realized was that nobody was really working on this issue. So I contacted Amnesty, I contacted Human Rights Watch, I was looking all over the internet, I was scouring libraries, I couldn't find anything. I would even call some very, very fantastic, well-intentioned refugee organizations, and I realized they didn't even exactly know what I was talking about. When I said stateless, they either thought I was talking about people of a minority group that wanted their own country, like the Kurds or the Palestinians, or they thought I was talking about people who had fled their homes due to violence and left their paperwork behind, and now they were facing all that bureaucratic nightmare. A stateless person doesn't have a passport to leave behind, right? They have no papers, ever. At least in this case. There are different reasons why people are stateless, which is part of the reason it's so complicated, but in most cases, they have just never had paperwork. So I started to find a few things. There's a fantastic photojournalist named Greg Constantine. He's the one that took these images, and he travels the world documenting stateless groups. And we now think that there are probably about 12 to 13 million people in the world who are stateless. But it's really, really hard to pin that number down because they're legally invisible, right? How do we find them? I'm happy to say that there's actually starting to be some movement on this. Refugees International is a DC NGO that's fantastic. They're probably the best ones if you want to go online and learn more about statelessness. The UNHCR, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is starting to do some work on this, as is the State Department. But it's still kind of below most people's radar, partly because it's so complicated and it's hard to have a solution that fits everything. But this is, I think, one of the ways that recognition really comes around, because we have people who are not being recognized as being worthy of national citizenship. But at a more fundamental level, I think we really see the denial of human dignity. People are being denied the bare essentials for life. Their human rights are being violated, and because they aren't citizens of any country, they have no one to go to bat for them, right? When we talk about human rights, the duty bearer of human rights is the government. They're the ones who are responsible. And so if you don't have a government that claims you, you're kind of out in the world on your own. Nobody's going to stand up for you. You belong nowhere. And this is a very, very bad place to be. So